Welcome to SVN3E Environmental Science. And tonight we are on lesson 4. We're looking at cycling of substances in ecosystems. All right, so in the booklet, it's page 17 of Unit 1. And if we go down in the booklet, we'll see we have 4 learning goals for tonight. It says students will be able to describe the relationships among consumers and producers in typical ecosystems. So we're going to have to go through what consumers and producers were, as well as let's have a little talk as well about what ecosystem means, and describe how human activity interferes with the cycling of substances in ecosystems. All right. The course at this point is going to take a little shift. We're actually going to shift a little bit away from what's called the abiotic factors, the idea that we're guardians of the planet Earth. And we're going to start looking specifically what we can do to maintain healthy ecosystems. So a big part of that has been our work we've been doing looking at the 3 spheres, known, and another word for them is the abiotic factors of an ecosystem: water, soil, and air. We've looked at what makes up water, soil, and air. We've looked at how we know if we have good water, soil, and air, how we test for that, how we monitor that over time. So we've done a lot of work on what's known as the abiotic parts of an ecosystem. And now we're going to get into some of the cycles of those substances, and that's going to begin our work looking at how organisms, animals, fish, bacteria, how they play a role with these other abiotic: water, air, and soil. And we're going to pull it all together, start to do that tonight. We'll go to the textbook in a few minutes, but I thought that the booklet actually gives a really nice brief overview of cycling of substances. We're going to get into some of the definitions. What is an ecosystem? Consumer, producer, etc. in the textbook. They have nice little layout there. So in the meantime, we will look at, we'll take and look at the what we talk about when we're talking about cycling of substances. So we're on page 18 of 25, and we're in Unit 1, Lesson 4. Okay, so some materials cycle continually. Okay, one of them is water. Water goes between, of course, water in the air, water as lakes, rivers, streams. We've also talked about groundwater, and then water in the soil. And it goes through all of these. It can be in moisture form and be in cloud, and then it condenses, falls as precipitation into the soil. Some of that runs off into other, goes into the ground. Some of that runs off into lakes, streams, ponds, and then some goes into groundwater, and then some of it goes back up into the clouds again, evaporates and forms clouds and comes back. And that is the water cycle, and we talked about that in previous lessons. Another cycle we've talked about is the carbon cycle. So carbon is actually can be anything from diamond. Diamond is carbon atoms that have really been compressed under a lot of heat and pressure for millions of years, and you get beautiful diamonds. It can also be what's left over in a fire. If you have a fire, the black, not the ashes that are gray, but the black charcoal, some people call it, that's carbon. Okay, and then there's carbon that's in a pencil that you can write on a paper, and that can be a lead. We call it a lead from back in the days when there was lead. Now it is carbon. And so you can see it can be in all sorts of different forms. Well, a really interesting thing about carbon is it is the one thing that is in all living beings. And it's in what we call carbohydrates, which, if you recall, when we talk about the process of capturing the sun's energy that plants undergo, and they create carbohydrates, which is energy that's in the form of food now that can be eaten. And it's also then in animals, plants, animals, humans. Um, and we're going to talk about how that happens, how it goes from one of those to the other. How do we get it from this the sun, plants, and animals? Um, Also, we know that carbon can come out of dead plants and animals from the process of decomposition. We have decomposers, and we'll talk about that. Um, we know that carbon can be released in the form of carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide when you have cars or factories burning fossil fuels, and that goes back into the air. Too much carbon is not good. So plants absorb carbon. So it's important that we continue to have a lot of plants on our planet. Keep it as green as possible because those are plants are absorbing the carbon dioxide we're producing from factories and cars, and they are changing it into a form that we can use for energy to eat, and also changing it into oxygen for us to breathe. Some of the pollutants have cycles. I forgot to mention one other important cycle that we've talked about, and that's the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen is another one, and if you'll recall from before, it's very important that that cycle's kept in balance. Most of the atmosphere is nitrogen. 78% of the air in our atmosphere is nitrogen, so it's really important that we keep nitrogen levels, especially in keep them in balance, especially in water and soils. If there's too much nitrogen, then things get out of whack, and we're going to talk about that. When pollution gets into the atmosphere, whether it's through water, soil, or air, it can also be part of cycling of substances. If we have, let's say, sulfur being produced by a factory when it's burned, and it mixes with oxygen, it becomes sulfur dioxide. Then that mixes with water, and we get sulfuric acid, and that is one of the forms of acid rain. There's other ones, but that's an example. Then it falls down on the vegetation, plants, into lakes, and causes those to become polluted. It goes into the soil and then goes back again into that system. So there's lots of those examples of pollutants being cycled. Okay, we're going to go over now to the textbook, and it's got some really good just going over to it now. Some really good information for us on these cycles, and we're going to start by introducing some terms. So the most important one is, I think we should start by introducing ecosystem. We've been using it quite a bit, and we have not really talked about what we mean by an ecosystem, we talked about producers, consumers, all of those. So those are all really important that we go through some of the definitions so everybody understands. Okay, we'll see there we're on page 29 of the textbook. So one of the reasons we're switching gears a little bit, it'll be pretty much though. I mean, we aren't changing topics completely here. We are looking at maintaining healthy ecosystems basically along the same lines as we are guardians of the planet. Okay, so we're going to learn about how we humans affect these cycles. So the first thing we need to do is we need to look at the some of the terms. So the first one's ecosystems. That's going to be all the living organisms like plants, animals, insects, fish perhaps, depending on the ecosystem, bacteria, fungi, all of those live things, those are called biotic components, and how they interact with what we call the abiotic. Those are the ones we've been talking about. Abiotic are water, soil, air. It could be sunshine. Sun has a huge place in an ecosystem, okay? So all those factors, um, even if it's very small community of organisms living in an area that has air, water, and soil, can be an ecosystem. Um, it's showing there a picture on page 29, figure 2.1, the boreal ecosystem in Canada, which is one of I'd say it's the largest ecosystem in Canada, and that's where we are. That's where we're located there in Ontario in the northern part. Some of the southern part of Ontario would be in slightly different, but for the most part, northern Ontario is all part of boreal ecosystem. And then a little bit of the prairie provinces and a little corner of Ontario, you'll see there is a different ecosystem, more of a plains. The plains are the prairies. So that would be more of that ecosystem. And BC would have, and Alberta would have also mountainous ecosystems. So those are all sorts of examples there. Really a great example of the boreal ecosystem there. Um, okay, ecosystems must have three groups of organisms, three um, living things that help to run the ecosystem. And they're broken down into producers. Producers are often thought of as plants because they're the organisms that make their own food through photosynthesis. But it could also be bacteria. Some bacteria are also able to make their own food. And so it could be bacteria, plants, but they make their own food through photosynthesis, or it could be, if it's a bacteria, it could be another chemical process. Consumers are the group of animals that eat other animals and plants, and they get energy. Okay, so you have energy being captured by the plants. They do that through photosynthesis. And then you have the different consumers eating plants. Then I shouldn't say different consumers, actually. There's different levels of the consumers. The primary consumers are herbivores. They eat only plants. So you would have rabbits, cows, moose. They eat plants, and they're known as the primary consumers. So they take in plants and they get their energy through that. So the plant gets energy from the photosynthesis, combining carbon dioxide, water, and sun energy. And then they get eaten by consumers, and that's how the energy goes up a level, we call that a level. Secondary consumers eat herbivores. So that would be another level of the ecosystem. So you would have perhaps a fox would eat a mouse, and the mouse has eaten a plant of some sort. And so the plant is your producer, the mouse is your primary consumer, okay? The fox is the secondary consumer, and there can be a tertiary. It's a third level consumer. It's eating second level consumers. So let's say we have another animal like a wolf eat the fox. Then that's the wolf, and we say they're the apex predator is the fancy word for that. They're at the top of the food chain, and they would have what's left of any energy the fox may have goes into the wolf. Now we know that we do not eat wolves. That is not something we hunt for food. It's not something we trap for food. We may trap them for their fur, but not necessarily to eat them. And the reason for that is because by the time you get to the tertiary level, you've pretty much used up the food the energy in the animals. There's a certain amount of energy that gets passed from the sun to the producers, from the producers to the consumers, and then it goes primary, secondary, and by the time you're getting to tertiary consumers, there's not a lot of energy left. There is a fourth level called quaternary consumers. I personally don't know example of that, and I should really look that up and see what an example is of a quaternary consumer. But they would be eating the tertiary. You'd have that would be interesting. You'll see the example given at the bottom of page 29 in figure 2.2, and you'll see that's one where we have the plants there. They look like bulrushes actually, and they're not the actual producers for this particular food chain. It's actually going to be phytoplankton in the water. That's something that is a type of water-based, they would be like, oh, I'm thinking of the word for them. They would be like organisms, really little organisms that live in the water called phytoplankton. They undergo photosynthesis. Then they are eaten by, let's say, crabs or any type of smaller crustacean living in the water. And then the secondary consumer there is looks like a turtle, and the turtle's eating the secondary consumer there's a fish. The fish is eating the crabs and the crayfish and those mollusks, and then the tertiary consumer looks like a fish, and the fish is eating the I mean the turtle. The turtle's eating the fish, and so the turtle's the tertiary consumer. So that's not an example there. That one there has let me look and see, can we come up with an example of a quaternary? That's a really good question, isn't it? Because really, it's not something I've ever got an example of. So let's look it up really quickly and see if we have something. Quaternary is a top level predator in a food chain. Okay, so here's an example. So this one starts with grass as the producer, grasshopper as the primary consumer, a frog as the secondary consumer, a snake as the tertiary consumer, and a hawk as a quaternary consumer. There you go. It's a very typical one we might have in this area. So there you go. That is an example of a quaternary predator. Okie dokie. Now, if we look on there, there is one other group, and that, of course, is our decomposers. Remember that if it wasn't for decomposers, waste and dead and dying matter would remain on the just sitting out. It's thanks to decomposers. Remember, those can be bacteria, fungi, and that's because of them that material is returned to the soil and the energy given back. Okay, so that's some good definitions of ecosystem, abiotic, biotic, producers, the different types of consumers, and of course decomposers. Okay, nitrogen and phosphorus are two other cycles that we've not really talked about. We've talked a lot about the water cycle. We just did that in our introduction tonight. We've talked a lot about the carbon cycle, and we will do that again. There are other examples of that we'll talk about when it's disrupted in particular. And now we're going to just look a little bit at nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. So water and carbon cycle through ecosystems as well as nitrogen. We know that nitrogen is in our atmosphere. We've talked about that. We also know that it needs to get fixed by nitrogen fixing bacteria to come out of the atmosphere and into plants that in a form that plants are able to take it in. There's something called nitrogen fixing bacteria. They're in the roots of legumes. What's a legume? A legume is like a bean. A bean's an example of a legume. Could be chickpeas, lentils, those types of things. Peas, soybeans, peanuts, those are legumes. And so we have legumes in the plants that are legumes, and they have these nitrogen fixing bacteria in their roots, and they fix the bacteria and turn it into ammonium. Ammonium is then taken by nitrifying bacteria and converted into nitrates. Plants then pick up the nitrates and they're able to then once again produce the ammonium. That is the nitrogen cycle. There's one other part to that cycle. We know that there's nitrogen in the atmosphere, and what happens is when it gets into the soil, we have what's called denitrifying bacteria. Denitrifying bacteria then can take and convert nitrates back into nitrogen in the atmosphere. So there's a couple of ways we get that process. And then plants and animals, dead and dying plants and animals, get decomposed. Decomposed plants and animals form more ammonium. And then remember, it gets changed into nitrates. By denitrifying bacteria, it goes back into the atmosphere and the cycle goes again. If we did disrupt or this cycle does not occur, then plants and animals will die. You do not want too little or too much. Remember, all of these levels that we talked about the last couple of classes, it's very important that they are balanced. So we want to make sure that we don't have too little, and it's also just as important not to have too much. Though if we have too much nitrogen in the atmosphere, and remember we could add sometimes we can add fertilizers, other types of things to the soil to make it richer. However, that can also cause too much nitrogen to be produced, and then we get some problems with that where we got the algal blooms. Remember, we have too many plants growing, and if too many plants grow, then we know that that causes the plants beneath not to get any oxygen and not to be able to undergo photosynthesis. Another cycle not talked about very often is the phosphorus cycle. So plants absorb phosphates from rocks in the soil that have phosphorus in them, and they absorb it through water, and then it goes from the water into the soil and then comes back out of the soil. Phosphorus is important. It builds teeth and bones. It's needed for metabolism. Metabolism is breaking down food into energy. So, but again, you want a balanced amount of sulfur. Too much sulfur is like anywhere else, it's going to cause issues. So, if you look at the top of page 31, figure 2.4, you'll see there is the phosphorus cycle. You'll see there's plants and animals being decomposed and turned into phosphate. And then phosphate is in the soil and gets absorbed by plants. Animals eat the plants, they decompose, turn back into phosphate in the soil. And then you'll see off to the other side of it, you'll see that rocks that contain phosphate are eroded by rain and wind and other processes, geological processes. When that happens, phosphate is part of the becomes part of the soil, and it becomes part of new rocks that form. And then over time, and I'm talking a very, very, very long time, there can be what's called geological uplifting, and then they go back into the atmosphere and back into the water, and the whole cycle repeats itself. Again, it's fine unless it gets off balance, it gets off balance. Okay, so page 31 says, how do human activities upset the cycle of substance through ecosystems? So we know lots of examples already from some of the lessons that we've talked about. We have farming. and we know what it can do to the atmosphere and the soil. We have cattle. Cattle release large amounts of methane into the atmosphere, which throws off the carbon cycle. They relieve ammonium into soil, which throws off the nitrogen cycle. Too much soil means too much nitrogens getting into groundwater, and then that flows, remember, underneath the surface is groundwater, and it flows to stream, rivers, and ponds. And then too much nitrogen in the water can be toxic, or on the other hand, it can make the plants grow too much. And then we have not enough oxygen, dissolved oxygen in the water, and all the organisms begin to die, aren't able to reproduce. Okay, you could also take things out of an ecosystem, but again, it's causes all sorts of problems. Remember that we talked about how erosion can strip away that important top soil, that horizon A part of soil that holds the most richest part of soil, and that's very important that that part of soil is not affected, and if it is, we have to go back and uh, and try to fix the problem with chemicals, fertilizers, maybe manure from um, cows, all of those fixes. And don't forget that it also can produce acid rain. And so acidic soil can be produced from acid rain, again, killing plant life and then the animals that rely on it. You can have a desert where your fertile soil once had all sorts of plants and animals and a thriving ecosystem. Through erosion, through acid rain, through farming, all these processes, logging, mining. If you know you're not careful to maintain that ecosystem, it can turn into a desert. So overgrazing of livestock, not planting. Remember, we were saying that if you want to keep that rich topsoil, you have to have dead and dying plant and animal matter, not replenishing the soil and letting it become unable to support life will often lead to having a desert and it blowing away, any rich soil blowing away. Okay. We can look at human activities in the same way we look at natural ecosystems. So we could look at human activities divided into three groups. So there's, first of all, natural ecosystems and human activity systems. So a natural ecosystem means that you have decomposers in the ecosystem and they recycle all the substances. So the plants and animals die. They are what's called biodegradable. That means decomposers can break it down and return it to the ecosystem again. Okay, so if something's biodegradable, it can be broken down by decomposers and returned and recycled through the ecosystem again. Human activity systems do not have efficient decomposers, and the goods people are making are not biodegradable. So, consumer goods that people no longer need are dumped into a dump, a waste disposal site, and they aren't released. Like some of them eventually could over long time, but some never can. There's plastics. There's some other toxic chemicals. Those are not gonna break down and turn into nice rich soil that can be returned to the ecosystem. So that's in a human activity system. So there's a lot of talk about packaging. Packaging that can be recycled, that's a good thing because that's what we want to do is recycle as many things as possible because those do get turned back into useful products. However, anything that can't be recycled and has to go to a dump. Can't be part, remember we talked about setting up some decomposers ourselves in our yards, having the um, the bins so that we can put our potato peels, apple cores, coffee grounds, sorry, coffee grounds, and we can put those in there and they can be all broken down into nice, rich soil that can be then put back into your garden or your lawn or whatever you want to use it for. So if we have things that don't get put into those, then that is part of a human activity system and it needs to be dealt with. Okay, you'll see figure 2.5 is a human activity system. You'll see there's producers is the oil. There's that's a oil rig there producing oil. The consumer are the vehicles and the factory. And the decomposers are recycling the used oil, breaking it down naturally into a manner that they're probably, in this case, I think they have developed some bacteria that can decompose oil. They're really looking at it for things like oil spills that give so much damage to the environment. But in this particular diagram, I think it must be some chemical method that they're using to decompose that. Okay, cycling human-made substances through an ecosystem, biosolids. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about biosolids because we have talked a lot about human activities that are not sustainable. Sustainable means that the ecosystem meets our needs today and is not going to harm the ecosystem for future generations. We're able to use the ecosystem now and we will save it and it will be available for our future generations. That's what sustainable is. We've talked a lot about that so far. So if we look at an example of something that's not sustainable, it's called unsustainable as a matter of fact, we can see how we are trying to change that. So biosolids is an example of how unsustainable activities harm these cycles. We're going to go over to page 33 and you can see there that they're part of municipal sewage treatment plants. So remember we talked about how sewage is sent to the sewage treatment plant. It's processed through chemicals. You'll see there on page 33, figure 2.6 shows all of the waste being collected. The sewage is then treated. There is a gas that's safe. It's tested. Remember, we talked about testing gas and released back into the environment. There's solid waste that can then maybe go to the land. And then there's liquid waste that can get pumped back into lakes or surface water of some sort. And hopefully that process is safe. We talked a little bit about examples of when that hasn't occurred and how important it is for municipalities like Sioux Lookout, and Walkerton was the one that we talked about earlier that had problems, to be testing all of this. Okay. However, we're talking about this process as having these, remember we said, what do we do with some of this stuff that's left over from treating sewage? It all can't be just released into the atmosphere, the land, or the water. And so biosolids is an example of what is produced when we have sewage treated. You can dispose of biosolids in different ways. They can go into the landfill. If you go to some landfills, I'm not sure where they are in Sioux Lookout anymore. They used to be right at the dump. They might still be, and I just don't know where they are, but I don't think so. They will have pits where sewage waste is put. That is from perhaps people who have a septic tank that gets filled with sewage, and then it just gets carried to a pit in a sewage disposal disposal truck. Um, and the town of sure the municipalities have collected it, and they can use it to help revive an area that got an ecosystem that got destroyed from erosion. So remember that the top layer of soil can be stripped by mining, for instance. Strip mining is a process where they go in and they take off the top layer of land, and underneath is where the minerals um, that they're looking for are found. So, strip mining can cause erosion. Also, it can produce dangerous toxins that then go into the soil all around it. And so, an example of where this happened was in the United States. They had Chicago, which is a big city, had biosolids from its waste disposal site, and they took it and put it into the soil in near an area or on an area that had been strip mined and revived the soil. Um, and it did. It neutralized the acidic soil in the area, and it's now a prairie ecosystem. And the chemicals are no longer toxic to the groundwater in the area. So that's an example of how we can take something like biosolids, which can be seen as waste, and use it for good. That's something we want to always keep our mind on. Is what can we do to revive ecosystems? We want to have as many healthy ecosystems on our planet as possible. Another way we can use biosolids is fertilizer. Remember, we could put manure um, on top of the soil that's not nice and rich, and decomposers come in and they break it down and turn it into a rich soil. However, anytime we take an ecosystem, whether it's healthy right now or is needed to be revived, we have to be careful because of the balance. There's some things in the biosolids that you have to be really careful about. One of them is if they have what's called pathogens. Pathogens are like bacteria or a fungi or something like that that is toxic to plants and animals and humans. So you'd have to be careful about that. You'd also have to be careful that if there's any dangerous minerals or chemicals um, in the biosolids, like mercury or lead or something, you wouldn't want to be putting that on and trying to revive an ecosystem because all you're doing is making it more toxic. Um, Towns and cities are continuing to learn ways to use biosolids. Um, it In the past, some of the biosolids were full of dangerous chemicals, and we're learning better and better methods to clean it up. If you look there on page 34, figure 2.7, it shows a really great example of collecting the human waste. So you'll see humans consume fish. Fish consume aquatic plants. Aquatic plants grow in streams. The water from the stream comes from groundwater, and the groundwater comes from the land where the plants were growing. And you can see that compost was used to put on the crops. A belt press dewatering process has taken the biosolids and processed them. And you'll see there that there's a primary cleaning of the biosolids, a secondary cleaning, and an oxygen-free digestion that's known as anaerobic digestion. And it produces gas, and some of the gases from the biosolids can also be used so that we have that used. So there's all sorts of ways of taking that waste that and using it. You just have to be careful that you're not going to disrupt the ecosystem. This brings us to our first set of check your understanding questions on page 34. It says, what are two uses of biosolids? And we talked about that. We talked about how biosolids can be used, and that's on the previous page. And to describe three methods of disposing of biosolids. So we can look at some of the positive and negative methods of disposing of biosolids. But we have to be careful with any substance we add to an ecosystem. And we just need to remember that ecosystems are very, very sensitive. And so we want to always be sure if we're going to solve a problem, we aren't just creating another one. There's an interesting story, and I'm going to go to it right now for a minute. I think we have time. Yeah, we're good. And I'm going to go over to a story about a man who, let's just see if I shared that. Yeah, good. His name's David Latimer, and I love this story. You'll see there, there he is on the screen. Double check everybody's looking at what I'm looking at. Yep, there he is. I'll make it a little bigger. And there he is. That's David Latimer. And you can see he has a great big glass jug looking thing that he put those plants, that soil, the air and the water, he put in 1960. That ecosystem, it's called a terrarium because it's on the land. Land ecosystems are terrariums. And remember water ecosystems? Do you know? Aquariums. Yeah. So here's his terrarium. It's been going since 1960. The only thing he's ever done is in 1974, he added a little bit of water to it because it looked a little bit dry, and he keeps it in the sunshine. That's it. That entire ecosystem in there is being kept going by sunshine and by everything inside. The plants, there's some organisms in there, and then there's some bacteria. So you have sunlight, water, soil, air, you have plants, and some consumers, and you would have some decomposers, all in that same ecosystem. And they've lived like that since 1960. So that is 65 years that ecosystem has been going. So yeah, I thought that was a good idea. And that is an undisturbed, and it is an undisturbed ecosystem that hasn't had anything added or taken out and is completely in balance. Okay, we're going to go back to our textbook now. Alrighty, we're going to look now. Get that one going. We're going to look now at the check your understanding questions at the bottom of page 34. I think we covered question 1. What are two uses of biosolids? Half mark for each use for 1 mark. And 3 methods of disposing of biosolids. And again, you could come up with positive or negative examples. There's some on both of the pages talking about biosolids. Okay, now we're going to go over to the review questions. There's only a few at the bottom of page 35. You'll see section 2.1 review questions. Question 1, describe the difference in roles between a producer and a consumer in an ecosystem. So basically tell me, what does a producer do in an ecosystem and what does a consumer do? Okay, question 2, describe how an ecosystem can recycle the waste produced by consumers and producers. That's worth 1 mark. And we know exactly how we do that now. We've covered that quite a bit. You should be able to tell me right away how wastes that are produced by consumers and producers get recycled back into the ecosystem. Number 3 is worth 2 marks. It says in an ecosystem, that contains farms. Describe a human activity that could upset the cycling of substances through the ecosystem. So we've gotten lots of examples of that. Um, you can come up with one of your own that maybe you know about, where it's that you've witnessed or that you are aware of. Um, and don't forget the substances we're talking about. It could be the um, nitrogen cycle could get disrupted. It could be water cycle could get disrupted. Okay, so there's lots of, it could be the water cycle. We've talked about all those cycles. So describe a human activity and explain how it's upsetting the cycling of substances through the ecosystem. Number 4 says identify and describe one key difference between natural ecosystems and human activity systems. There was a couple of in the readings in the textbook talking about the processes in each of those ecosystems, and there's one process that's really important that we've talked about a lot that you could describe there, and that's worth 2 marks. So you need to come up with a difference by explaining in that same answer how natural ecosystems do a process and then how human activity systems do a process, so that you're giving me 2 points there. Okay, number 5, on a sheet of paper, redraw figure 2.5. So this one here has given people a really hard time in the past. So I wanted to just go look at that and and just review that. Okay, this example here is a human activity system, figure 2.5 on page 32. I think it's easier if you do a natural ecosystem. Natural ecosystems are quite easy. There's quite a few examples already given, and if you go and look in your own area, you can come up with a producer, a consumer, and a decomposer quite easily. And it doesn't even say whether it has to be um, a primary, secondary, tertiary, just a consumer. That's it. You just want one producer. Draw me a picture of the producer, draw me a picture of the consumer, and then draw me a picture of a possible decomposer. So remember, producers make their own food. Those are plants. So pick a plant, could be a tree, trees are plants, could be in the water, could be on the land. So pick me a plant that and put that as your producer. Then the consumer is any animal that you want to, that's, let's say, eating that plant. So if you're going to pick a plant, pick an animal that eats that plant. That's it. We only need the 2 things, a producer and a consumer. It's not even asking you to pick a secondary or tertiary, primary, secondary, tertiary. It's just wants a producer and a consumer. And then your third picture is a decomposer. Now, I do understand that. How do you draw bacteria if that's what you're going to use? Or, but you could just look online. There's all sorts of examples on the internet, and there's some examples in the readings. In the textbook, especially, had some nice examples of decomposers there. So I don't necessarily want you to use this figure 2.5 of the human activity in ecosystem. Just pick one in your area. Okay, we're going to go back. Sorry, I'm flipping through here. Okay, and then number 6. What are 2 concerns about the use of biosolids? So we've talked about biosolids. They're the waste left over after sewage is treated, wastewater sewage is treated. We have biosolids left over. What are the concerns about using them? We know they can regenerate an ecosystem by creating healthy soil, but then what are some things in biosolids that might appear that can be dangerous to the ecosystem? All right, That is it for tonight. Thank you so much. Next class, we will go on to looking at some more ways that we can improve ecosystems, make them sustainable and healthy. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, and good night.